I'm Sean Rehaag. I'm the director of York University Center for Refugee Studies, and I'm also a faculty member at Osgoode Hall Law School. This video is part of the CRS Online Introduction to Refugee Studies. In another video, we look at the history of refugee protection in Canada, as well as at Canada's inland refugee determination system. That is, we look at how Canada responds to people who come to the country and claim asylum. In this video, we look at another way that people can obtain refugee protection in Canada, through Canada's refugee resettlement programs. Refugee resettlement is one of three durable solutions available to refugees, the others being repatriation and local integration. Resettlement involves the transfer of refugees from one country of asylum to another state that has agreed to admit them and ultimately to grant them permanent settlement. Every year, around 30 countries take part in the United Nations High Commission for Refugees Resettlement Program, and through that program resettle thousands of refugees. While these numbers may seem large, they actually represent less than 1% of the refugees in need of protection worldwide. For most of the past decade, the United States has been the world's top resettlement country, with Canada, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Germany, France, Australia, and the Nordic countries also providing a substantial number of resettlement places. With changes in the U.S. administration's policy towards refugees during the Trump administration, Canada has surpassed the U.S. as the leading refugee resettlement country, resettling around a quarter of the approximately 100,000 refugees resettled worldwide every year. Refugees who are resettled to Canada come to the country in one of two ways, either through the government-assisted refugees program or through the private sponsorship program. Either way, when resettled refugees arrive in the country, unlike for asylum seekers, they arrive as permanent residents of Canada, with all of the rights that that status entails. They also eventually become eligible for Canadian citizenship. Okay, so let's first look at government-assisted refugees, or as they are often called, GARs. In order to be resettled by the Canadian government as part of the GAR program, a refugee must first register for refugee status with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees or with state authorities in their country of asylum. Then their case must be referred to Canada by the UNHCR or by another designated referral organization. Once a case is referred, a Canadian visa officer will review the file and will generally interview the applicant. The applicant will also be required to undergo medical, criminality, and security screenings and to provide biometric information. These screenings are meant to verify that the applicant is admissible to Canada and does not pose a safety or security risk. Once the applicant passes these screenings, they will travel to Canada, often with the help of a partner organization such as the International Organization for Migration. Under the GAR program, once the refugee is in Canada, the costs of their initial resettlement will be supported by the government for up to 1 year from their date of arrival. Support is delivered by a network of non-governmental agencies that are funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. These settlement agencies provide temporary housing, assist with finding permanent housing, help with registering for federal and provincial programs, help with orientation in the community, and provide referrals to other refugee and settlement programs, including assistance with job searches and language acquisition. The second way that refugees can be resettled to Canada is through the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program. Canada, until recently, was the only country in the world to offer a private sponsorship program. Recently, however, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and the UK have begun to develop private sponsorship programs. Founded in 1979 at the height of the Southeast Asian refugee crisis, Canada's program allows for private individuals or groups to sponsor refugees directly, thereby playing a concrete role in the protection and resettlement of refugees. Research has suggested that privately sponsored refugees have better integration outcomes than government-assisted refugees. However, it is also important to note that the demographics of privately sponsored refugees may be quite different from government-assisted refugees. Privately sponsored refugees tend to have higher education levels, greater language proficiency, and more social capital to begin with. They may also already have family members present in Canada. All of this can contribute to a more rapid and effective integration. In contrast, government-assisted refugees are often selected specifically because they face greater vulnerability. For instance, women facing gender-based violence, single-parent families, and refugees with special needs. While the GARP program is sometimes better at meeting the needs of the most vulnerable refugees, it should be acknowledged that Canada's private sponsorship program has enabled thousands of refugees to access protection in Canada, protection that they would have likely otherwise not been able to access. Within Canada's private refugee sponsorship program, who can be a sponsor? Well, Canadian citizens and permanent residents can apply to sponsor refugees for resettlement in 3 ways. First, by forming a group of 5, that is, 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents who come together to sponsor a refugee. Second, by being a member of a community sponsor organization, which may be an unincorporated organization, an association, or a corporation. Or third, through a sponsorship agreement holder arrangement, which involves an incorporated organization signing an agreement with the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada to resettle refugees on an ongoing basis. In order to be eligible to sponsor a refugee, the sponsor or sponsoring group must establish their financial capacity to support the refugee for 12 months and must provide a settlement plan. Following the arrival of the refugee, the sponsor has both financial and settlement responsibilities. This includes providing ongoing support, accommodations, basic necessities of life, and settlement assistance, such as helping to facilitate access to education, employment, language classes, and the like. Who can be sponsored under Canada's private refugee sponsorship program? In order to be eligible for resettlement under this program, applicants must meet 3 criteria. First, they must have a sponsoring group, either a group of 5, a community sponsor, or a sponsorship agreement holder. Second, they must meet the basic eligibility criteria. This includes being outside their country of origin and outside of Canada, and meeting the definition of a convention refugee or falling within the country of asylum class. For convention refugees, the general requirement is that applicants have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. For more details about the convention refugee definition, please see the video about international refugee law. The country of asylum class includes those who are outside of their country of origin and who have been seriously affected by civil war or armed conflict, or who have been denied basic human rights. Regardless of whether they fall within the convention refugee class or the country of asylum class, applicants must also be unable to return to their country of origin, be unable to integrate into the country in which they currently reside, and have no other durable solution available to them. They must also show that they will be able to settle successfully in Canada. Third, applicants must also be admissible to Canada. In other words, they must receive a positive interview decision from a Canadian visa officer, and they must pass medical, security, and criminality screenings. How are applicants matched with sponsors in Canada's privately sponsored refugee resettlement program? Well, there are 2 main ways that this can be accomplished. The first and primary way is sponsor-referred cases. In such cases, the group submits the name of a refugee or a refugee family that it is interested in sponsoring. These groups may obtain the identity of the refugee from an overseas contact, a friend, a community member, a relative, or elsewhere. This idea of naming, or of sponsors selecting the sponsored person, is one of the core strengths of the private refugee sponsorship program, in that it allows Canadians to respond to the needs of individual refugees or of particular refugee communities that concern them the most. Alternatively, a refugee may be visa office referred. The Resettlement Operations Centre in Ottawa maintains an inventory of cases that have been referred by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada works to find sponsors for these cases. A newer pathway for sponsorship that the Canadian government has created is the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. In this program, a refugee who has been referred for resettlement by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is matched with private sponsors in Canada. The Government of Canada will provide up to 6 months of income support for refugees resettled through this program, while private sponsors will provide another 6 months of financial support, as well as startup costs and social and emotional support. One of the guiding principles of private refugee sponsorship is the concept of additionality. Private sponsorship was originally intended to be a supplementary form of protection for refugees, above and beyond what was already provided by the Canadian government. Every year, the Canadian government establishes a target number of refugees to be resettled. The breakdown of that number as between government-assisted refugees, private sponsorship, and now the blended visa office referred program has sometimes been contentious. Many refugee advocates have campaigned for the government to take the lead and to increase the number of government-sponsored refugees. The primary concern is that private sponsorship should not be used as a way for the government to offload its refugee protection responsibilities onto the private sector, but rather to increase the number of spots available for resettlement. Many of the strengths of the private sponsorship program are self-evident. It allows a greater number of refugees to be resettled to Canada, enables individuals to assist refugees in concrete ways, allows people in Canada to sponsor specific refugees, including family members who might not otherwise have had access to resettlement, and creates connections between Canadians and newcomers that can facilitate integration. Moreover, private sponsors often have the time, the community connections, and the social and emotional resources to provide support in a way that the government cannot. Canada's private sponsorship program, however, is not without its challenges or its controversies. One of the big challenges is that the system has an unfortunate propensity for delays. Even for a refugee who has been referred by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and who has a sponsor in Canada waiting to cover all of the costs, it can take months and even years for Canadian officials to process the completed application. And then it can take months after the sponsorship has been approved for the refugee to arrive in Canada. Processing times also vary greatly by region, and there has been some critique over how the Canadian government allocates resources to its overseas visa offices. For instance, applications from Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and South Sudan are all processed through a single visa office in Nairobi. Processing times vary greatly as well. For example, as of May 2020, the processing time for an application for private sponsorship from Kenya is 14 months, whereas a Syrian refugee in Lebanon will have a processing time of 26 months. Another potential drawback of private sponsorship is that the system requires government oversight. Privately sponsored refugees are quite dependent on their sponsors, both financially and otherwise. There have been some instances of breakdowns in the sponsorship relationship, and even some instances of exploitation and abuse. This has led some to call for greater oversight over the private sponsorship program. Another concern about refugee resettlement more generally is that this is an area that sometimes becomes quite politicized. For example, Canada sometimes engages in group resettlement. This means identifying a group of particularly vulnerable refugees and then implementing procedures to address their specific situation. Canada has done this with several groups in recent years. For example, Canada resettled 5,000 Bosnian Muslims in 1992. 5,000 Kosovar refugees were resettled in 1999. 3,900 Karen refugees living in Thailand were resettled in 2006. And, most recently, 25,000 Syrian refugees were resettled in 2015-16. Sometimes group resettlement occurs through the government investing additional resources into the existing government-assisted refugees or private sponsorship programs. At other times, recognizing that these programs can have very lengthy processing delays, the government creates ad hoc programs through discretionary immigration tools, including humanitarian and compassionate exceptions to the regular process for obtaining permanent residence in Canada. The availability of these exceptional and discretionary programs allows the government to respond quickly to pressing and immediate needs by groups of refugees. However, because these programs are discretionary, there is also a risk of politicization of refugee policy. In other words, political factors may influence which groups in need of immediate resettlement are assisted, and which groups with similar levels of need are not. One final point about the politicization of Canada's refugee resettlement regime is worth noting. There are perennial concerns raised within Canada's refugee advocacy communities about the way that some Canadian political parties use Canada's refugee resettlement programs as tools with which to attack Canada's inland refugee determination process. The way this works is that people who arrive in Canada and claim asylum are presented as, quote, jumping the queue, unquote, and displacing those who are waiting patiently for resettlement from abroad. This is not an accurate portrayal. There is no connection between the number of asylum seekers who arrive in Canada in any given year and the number of people resettled in Canada. This means that no applicants for resettlement are displaced when someone seeks asylum in Canada through the inland refugee determination system. Moreover, for the large majority of asylum seekers, there simply is no queue. Recall that refugee resettlement only applies to people who have already obtained asylum in another state. Recall also that processing for resettlement can take years. Resettlement programs are thus not viable options for people looking to leave countries where they face persecution and who are in need of immediate protection. Even for those refugees who are in principle eligible for Canadian resettlement programs, the number of resettlement positions available is vastly outstripped by the demand for these positions. In that context, it is perfectly reasonable for people to exercise their right under international refugee law to seek asylum. Overall, despite the limitations in Canada's refugee resettlement regime, and despite the way that that regime is too often used for political purposes, it would be fair, nonetheless, to characterize Canada as a world leader on refugee resettlement. In recent years, some countries have replicated Canadian innovations in this area, including by creating their own private sponsorship programs. I hope that in the coming years, more countries follow suit and offer durable solutions to the increasing number of refugees in need of resettlement.